Our second presenter today, Maria Emerson, I am so thrilled was able to join us for this. She is our new student success librarian, and even at her job talk like a year ago, I was like, oh wow, like I hope it's not weird if I email this person and ask them to be a part of this. So everything worked out. Maria is here and is going to talk about all the work that she did at her previous position at Augustana College, working on building a social justice zine collection. So thank you so much for doing this, Maria. We're thrilled that you're here.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen to pull up a PowerPoint. Let's see. All right, can people see that? Okay, awesome. So I'm gonna start my video really quick. All right, so yeah, thank you for the introduction. My name is Maria Emerson. My pronouns are she, hers, and I have a personal and professional interest in zines. So to get this started, an overview of what I'm going to talk about, I'll give a background and intro to myself, and then I'll talk about how I went about building a social justice zine collection at Augustana College, and how I was able to use that in classrooms with discussions with students, and also especially talking about how zines play into authority and credibility. And then I also want to have you interact a little bit. So there'll be a couple of quick polls and then a discussion question that I actually did with my students at Augustana. So I wanted to see what your responses would be like. And then at the end, there'll be time for questions. I'm pretty flexible, so if you have any questions during the talk and you want to interrupt, I'm totally fine with that. I'm not good at monitoring chat, so it's probably better if you just unmute yourself and interrupt me. But we can get started. So to start with a quick poll, I want to get a gauge on people's backgrounds with zines. So there's two ways to do this. You can either click on the link I'm going to put in chat in a minute, or you can do this on your phone. It's pretty easy. Let me get it in here really quick. So this will help me see if you have experience with zines or if this is brand new to you. 302, that's the pin. So if we click on that, we should be able to see the results. Let me get the, oops. All right, and let's look at the results here. Okay. So if you're able to click on the link or do this through your phone, people able to access the poll? I don't have the best luck with polls sometimes in Zoom, so let's see how this goes. All right, let me refresh this then. All right, okay, so this is pretty split down the middle. This is awesome. Some people are just starting to learn about them, some love zines, and some make them. All right, so this is good to get understanding of where we are. All right, so going back to this, let me see here. So as we have said, I am the student success librarian at U of I. I started this past June, but for the last 4 years, I was one of the research and instruction librarians at Augustana College. In addition to being one of the librarians there, I had a couple of different roles that allowed me to interact with students a lot. So I was a first-year advisor. I taught a couple of entry-level classes in the liberal arts. And then I also, for 2 of those years, was the faculty in residence, meaning that I lived in one of the residence halls with my family, and I provided support to students in that way, either through personal conversations or more formal programming. I've also always had an interest in social justice in libraries. I'm very interested in sense of belonging with students and how libraries can support that both in and out of libraries. And I also want to know who is missing from the library. So we talk a lot about how libraries are safe spaces for people. And I think that is true to an extent for sure, but I do think that's not the case for everyone. So I want to know, how do we reach students who aren't physically in the library space? So one of the ways for me to learn how to do this better was I took an online class through the ALA about social justice in academic libraries. And it was in that class that I was introduced to zines for the first time. So I've actually only had experience with zines for probably about 3 years now, I would say, maybe closer to 4. But I automatically fell in love with them. Let me go to the next slide. All right, so I loved that zines are just completely free. I love that there was no rules with it and that people could write about all these different experiences, some of which I could relate to, some of which I couldn't. I love that people could write and they could draw and they could format this in any way they wanted to. I'm also a really visual person, and I found myself actually understanding and remembering some subject matters better in a zine format than I would in a research article. And I think what was most intriguing to me about zines was that they didn't have to prove themselves. Zines don't have to go through an editing system. They don't have to be told what's right and what's wrong about them. They aren't made for profit, either financially or job security wise. Zines do exist solely to exist. And I wanted this in my library. I wanted it in the classroom. And I had already seen how, even at that point, students were just getting tired of research papers and reading research articles. And I wanted to show them that there are other ways to learn about topics and other ways to communicate experiences that they have or that they're interested in. So I started a social justice zine collection. And I had 2 goals in mind when I started this. The first was to have something that students could turn to and find solidarity in. And the second goal was for students and faculty to consider what we view as acceptable sources in research. So I wanted zines in the classroom, and a good way to do that was to have a collection ready that faculty and students could turn to, and I could bring to the classes to show them with physical examples. Social justice is a pretty broad topic. It's designed that way on purpose. I thought for a little while about having it focus more on 1 or 2 different themes, but I was worried that students would miss opportunities that to read about zines that either they had experience with or that they just had a particular interest in. So by having it be social justice, it seemed like a good way to cover a wider array of topics. So I knew what type of collection I wanted, but what was I looking for specifically when it came to purchasing different types of zines? So I had a couple of things in mind. I wanted them to be perzines, also known as personal zines. I wanted students to see that lived experiences can add to the conversation. It can add to research in ways that traditional peer-reviewed sources can't or won't. I also wanted to provide coverage of some of the gaps we had in our mainstream publications. So especially by underrepresented voices. I'm going to be talking a bit about how zines relate to authority and credibility a bit in this talk, but it's also important to mention that zines often cover topics and experiences not found in mainstream publications. There are articles about some of these topics, absolutely, but this always presented in a very different way than zines are. Research is research. It's often written in a way that presents the human side to things. It's neutral for a reason. But in that neutrality, it also creates a distance between the reader and the research and or the subject and subject matters. So someone could read about an experience, but it doesn't necessarily provide that solidarity or validation that they might be seeking. Zines also have historically been a place for marginalized communities to share experiences and thoughts. History and textbooks are often whitewashed, and mainstream publications often exclude and not focus on these experiences that need a space. So zines help fill some of those gaps in. It also was, I wanted the zines to increase sense of belonging with students in the library and out of the library. Students always see academic sources all the time in academic libraries, but it's important for them to see a variety of materials. So they need to see value in different backgrounds and voices, and they need to see that libraries see that as deserving a space in their collection, that it's important for others to be aware of it. It also lets students know their experiences are valid. They might be struggling with different things, different thoughts, and if they're not seeing any of those experiences on the shelves in a library or as an e-resource, it can make them feel more alone. So if they see it in some format in a library, it lets them know that their experience is valid. And then, of course, as I said, zines challenge this idea of authority and credibility, and I'll go more into that in a little bit. So I want this to be a time for you to engage. So I had to think about what types of zines, what types of topics students would like to see in a social justice zine collection. So I want to take a minute and have you either unmute yourself or you can put in the chat, what are some topics that you think students would have liked to see? So you can put it in the chat or unmute yourself. Queer history and experiences, mental health. Yep. Mental health, yep, again. Public health, yep. All right. Okay, these are excellent answers. So you were right. So it seemed that the zines that students gravitated towards the most were zines that focused on mental illness, sexual assault, LGBTQA+ topics. And I don't think this is particular to Augustana students. I don't even think it's particular to college students in general. I think these are all very human issues. But it was important to think about what do students really want in the beginning of creating this collection. So like I said, I was in a really unique position at Augustana because not only through my professional job, but then also I would go home in a place where students lived because I was in one of the residence halls. So I was able to see what programs students frequented the most. I also had students come and talk to me about lots of different issues that they were going through. So it really helped me become more aware of things that they saw as really pressing issues in their lives, on campus, nationally. Activism was actually one that I hadn't thought of, but once the collection got started, we had a number of requests from students to have zines that related to activism in some way. So college students really want to be involved and engaged. I think especially Gen Z, they want to make a difference in society. So they are often looking for ways to work with activism in some way. So when it came to collection development, anyone who works in collection development in some way knows that it can be difficult to select materials because oftentimes your own privilege and your interests can interfere with the process. And you don't want it to, and you try really hard not to, but it's also hard because you don't know what you don't know. So if you don't have an experience or a connection to something in some way, it can sometimes go unnoticed. And I knew that I could be missing themes, and I'm sure I was missing themes and topics that students really wanted to know more about. So zine distros helped a lot with this. A main goal of this collection was to include topics and voices often excluded from mainstream publications. So I did look predominantly at zine distros that sold zines from BIPOC, female identified creators. It also allowed me to see a variety of different topics. A lot of these distros are really nice because they will organize their zines by topic. So I was able to see a variety of different examples, and that helped me see issues that I might not have any experience with or be aware of. So I listed 3 zine distros here that I used a bit of. This is not an extensive list by any means, but I do recommend these 3. They're really good. And then we also made the decision for it to be non-circulating. This was a hard decision, but zines are smaller. Oftentimes they're more fragile, and we didn't want them to go missing or be torn or anything like that, especially right when we're starting a collection. Many students did ask to take the zines home with them. They did understand why they couldn't when we explained the reasoning, but there clearly was that desire there. We did keep a count sheet so student workers could check on what zines were getting looked at the most, which helped us think about what additional zines we might want to add to our collection. So as I mentioned, we don't always get all of the students in the library that we want in the library. So there is outreach is really important for this. So there was a couple of different fairs I went to and brought zines to increase visibility for students who either are or aren't in the library. So this is a picture of me at the sexual health fair on campus. I also went to a campus diversity fair and brought zines that related to that topic. And this was great. Students really enjoyed looking through all the different zines that were there. You often would see them see a title that really stood out to them, and they would just grab it and they would stand there reading it. And you could see that there was this hunger and connection that was necessary for them to have. They are surrounded by academic sources in college and in academic libraries. So it was nice for them to be able to look at something that wasn't strictly academic and see that it related to topics that connected with them in some way. So that was really important and nice for them to see. And it provided validation, again, of either their own experiences or it was an eye-opening experience for them to read about someone else's experience, again, for lack of a better word. And then also we wanted zines to be easy to locate. So I designed categories for them that we could assign to each zine. So this could be like body image or queer topics or indigenous topics. So each zine would have that. It got a little bit complicated at times because a lot of times there was overlap in different areas, but we just looked at what seemed to be the main goal of the zine. And then our technical services librarian helped a lot with cataloging them in the catalog to make them easier to find. So they always were under a social justice heading, in addition to the category I assigned them in, and then they were all in one location that could be located in the catalog. And then physically, we put them in an area in the library that was a more laid back area, had comfy seating, games and puzzles for students to do in the library, and the zines were right there for them as well. And then lastly, I created a LibGuide about zines that I used in classes, but also directed students towards when they had questions about zines in general. And then in an effort to get students to take themselves seriously and know that what they say matters, I created a zine donation form that I would either hand to the students in classes I were helping them make zines in, or just had on the LibGuide. I told them that any zine they made could go into our special collections so that could be part of the college's history. It didn't have to be social justice related, even though our zine collection is social justice related. It could be anything. I just wanted them to know that what they said mattered and that it's important enough to add into our collection in a very permanent way. Okay, so remember that the first overarching goal of the collection was reaching the students, but the second was reaching the faculty. I wanted to encourage faculty to consider using zines as an alternative to the research paper or another assignment. I also wanted faculty to consider resources like zines for sources to use that were acceptable to them. Some were already very on board with using these very non-traditional sources in their assignments. Some needed a little bit more convincing, and that's okay. It was a new idea. So sometimes you need to convince people a little bit before they sign on. But as I said, I was a research instruction librarian at Augustana. So, and even in my new role here as a student success librarian, I still help, though on a much smaller scale, with library instruction and research support for students. However, at Augustana, the majority of my work had to do with teaching students information literacy. And so a lot of that involved going over peer-reviewed scholarly sources. So we talked about popular sources as well. However, when we talk about popular sources, there is always this really strong emphasis on credible. It has to be a credible popular source. And that's for a good reason. We don't want students to, fall into the trap of fake news or to look at sources that have a lot of misinformation on it. But when we place so much emphasis on what credible is, and we focus on the fact that these sources should be more reputable sources with a big name behind it, or maybe a prize-winning source such as the New York Times. So with that, though, it can be really hard to include this question that in the conversation, that is, who are we including in this conversation with our standards for inclusion? But more importantly, who are we excluding? So sometimes students are required to only have peer-reviewed or scholarly sources in their papers. That has never really sat well with me for a number of reasons. When we talk about peer-reviewed scholarly sources, we often imply that it's credible without consideration. And I'm not saying that that's the intention at all, but unfortunately it is implied enough that many times students feel like if they have found it in a library catalog, especially if it's from an academic journal, that they don't need to view it with a critical lens at all. That is fine the way it is, and that is done, they're going to use it in their paper. And there is a time for scholarly peer-reviewed articles, and there is a time for popular articles. However, we know that libraries are not unbiased. We know they're not perfect. And we also know that articles written in peer-reviewed journals aren't perfect either. So in my belief, we should be viewing all sources with the same amount of critical lens as we do with these often viewed less credible sources. But let's break this down a little bit more. So one of the issues is access to information. Access to information in higher education is a privilege. Not everyone has access to it, and not everyone will be contributing to these academic journals, and nor should they. For our society to work, we need people who are doing every type of job. However, we do act like academic sources, something that is a privilege to get our hands on, is infallible, which then means that only the privileged are lucky enough to have access to that type of information. And even with these more high-end popular sources, such as the New York Times, there is often a cost that comes to it. So I posted this tweet by Conan O'Brien that said, just read a fascinating New York Times piece that claimed I'd reached my free article limit for the month. I've had this happen to me many times. It's very frustrating, but it's just an example of how most things come at a cost when really information should be free to everyone. Next, it discredits lived experiences if we only want peer-reviewed sources. We are saying that the research behind something is more important and trustworthy than the actual experience of something. And that's not to say the research isn't important, it is, but it does imply that we might value one over another. It also silences many voices when we only want peer-reviewed sources. It goes back to privilege and who has access to publishing in academic journals. To publish in an academic journal, you often need to have a degree, normally multiple ones. That one at least works a little bit better. If you choose or are unable to continue with higher education the rest of your life, you will not have access to these very expensive resources that are found in library databases. So like I said, even the more credible sources, and I'm placing the emphasis on credible, like the New York Times often charge you after so many free articles a month. So people are going to be looking elsewhere for their information. One of the great things about zines is that it makes things accessible. It's written in a way that anyone should be able to understand, so you don't necessarily need to have a background in a particular field to understand it. Anyone can write one, meaning that you just need a pen and a paper to write one. And you don't need to have access to a college in order to get your hands on one, like you do with academic journals. And then lastly, a very important thing to consider is what I call these gatekeepers of knowledge. So this could be the publishing industry, libraries, and then faculty and post-secondary institutions. These are the people who decide what is published, what is selected to be in library collections, and they're also the people who are on editorial boards and those who submit articles to academic journals. But let's look at the demographics of these groups. So this is gonna be another poll. So it's gonna be the same as before. It's gonna be, you can either do this, actually, let me get to the next slide here. You can do this on the phone or through this link right here, and the pin's gonna be different this time. I do apologize in advance because there was not a way to make this poll a little bit more readable. So it looks a little bit grouped together, but hopefully you can figure it out. Sorry, I can't type and talk at the same time apparently. Okay, and the pin number this time is going to be 880608. All right, so take your best guess. Take your best guess on what you think the demographics are of these three industries. So I'm going to go to results. All right. Okay. I'll give you a minute to make a vote, and then we can go back. All right, okay. So we got different opinions here. Most people are saying that they think the publishing industry is 76% white, 74% women. Libraries are 83% white, 83% women, and faculty are 76% white and 46% women. All right, okay. So I'm gonna exit out of this. So, let's go. So yes, for those who guessed, it is publishing industry is 76% white, 74% women, libraries are 83% white, 83.2% women, and faculty are 76% white and 46.7% women. So at least with the faculty, it's more split, a little bit more even in terms of gender. That does exclude non-binary people or people who are gender fluid. And then with sexuality, I actually could only find reliable statistics on publishing, which is 81% straight have identified. So Looking at these stats, we now know that it's fairly homogeneous. These are the people who are making the decisions behind what people have access to and what they don't. So in academic libraries, it's up to the librarians to make sure that students feel like they belong in the library and that there are people with similar backgrounds to them and that there's a variety of perspectives and experiences that they can seek in sources. Students also need to form relationships with faculty and have mentors. And if the voices and mentors provided are fairly all from similar backgrounds, this can be a disservice. It also can decrease sense of belonging. Zines are much more inclusive. They tell very many perspectives and experiences and come from a variety of voices. So to talk a little bit more about lived experiences versus traditional sources, honestly, there's a lot of pros and cons to each. And it's kind of interesting because what may be a pro to one is a con to another. So for example, lived experiences do humanize issues, whereas traditional sources will dehumanize it because they're looking at it from a much more neutral standpoint. While traditional sources definitely have authority and credibility in it, lived experiences and the ways it's communicated, it normally lacks authority. And because of that, it can be seen as lacking credibility. So to give you an example of what I normally gave students to help put this into something they could understand a little bit easier, I always give the example of writing about food stamps. So we definitely need the statistics and the demographics and the history behind food stamps when we're writing about this in research. However, it's also important to hear from people who have that experience of living on food stamps. So how did it feel when they were applying for it? What were any barriers that were presented to them? How did people view them? How were they treated? And when you include information like that, it takes research paper to a whole other level because you're adding more to the conversation. All right, so talking about authority and credibility, students don't see themselves as an authority figure. They also aren't afraid to challenge authority and question authority. They actually seem to like it. But actually, I'm sorry, I skipped ahead a little bit. Let me go back. Okay, so we just talked about lived experience and traditional sources, but then how does that relate to authority and credibility? So as I said, the Social Justice Zine Collection was to help faculty become more comfortable with using sources like zines. They're great to bring into the discussion about what makes something credible. And we also talked about authority a lot with first-year students in the spring semester at Augustana, because we worked with this framework of authority is constructed and contextual. That was our focus in information literacy classes that semester. But even in these classes that didn't focus on that, we still talk about authority in different ways, even if we don't say the actual word. We talk about sources that we trust, and most of the time it has to do with sources that have more authority due to its reputation and its status. So this is a discussion question I would do with students. So I would always ask students in these classes, what do you think authority and credibility are? Do you think they're the same, or do you think they're different? Why or why not? So if you can help me out for a couple minutes and start a discussion, I would love to hear your opinions, especially compared to what the students would often say. So you can either unmute yourself if you're comfortable talking on Zoom, or if you want to put it in the chat, that's completely fine too. All right, so Louisa's saying that she thinks, or they think, lived experiences, sorry, now that the chat went ahead. Lived experiences inherently have credibility. Sarah says students feel like with students, I feel like we usually bring up credentials and relevant experience, which is different for different sources. That's a great point, Sarah. Anyone else have an opinion on this?
I think, well, I'm thinking of like, the last 20 months with like the government and the CDC having like authority, but then you know, in the eyes of some, not necessarily having credibility, or like government officials in general have authority, but maybe not credibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's actually really interesting because when I was talking to students a lot about this, a lot of them would bring up Trump. And they would be like, oh, yes, you could have authority without credibility. And then some other students would always get mad. So it always brought up about like a pretty interesting discussion. But yeah, they would definitely look at government when it came to that. Okay, going back to the chat. Spencer says authority is related to community agreed standards, peer review, credentials, etc. Virginia says, as an oral historian who teaches oral history, I believe that everyone has authority to tell the stories of their own lives. All right. And then Julia says, authority, credibility are different. Authority implies control as a factor and credibility is more about integrity. All right, okay, yeah. Okay, so great. So students, I just realized I was talking about with the mute button on. Students had always interesting answers with this. There was always, some students seemed to understand right away there was a difference between the two. Some had needed a little bit more of a discussion to get to that point. But one thing that Gen Z is really not afraid to do is to question authority. However, students are hesitant to think that at their own age, they can also have authority. So they just don't see themselves in authority position. And I think it's because there's always someone who has more power and authority over them. So this could be like a faculty member or a librarian, their parents or a caretaker or a coach. However, when we reframe the conversation to relate to them in a different way, so I would say, well, many of you are older siblings, captains of a sports team. You could be a natural leader of a group. You could be president of a Greek life chapter or a club or something along those lines. And that always seemed to help them realize like, oh, there is different levels of authority and authority is viewed differently in different groups. So how does this relate to zines? Well, the zine collection really helped me expand this conversation of sources and what it has to do with credibility with faculty, because zines really challenge this idea of authority and credibility. Zines have always pushed this idea of what's acceptable and what isn't. It pushes the idea of who belongs in what space. Zines have been a place for marginalized communities to turn to in some way. And it also pushes this idea of what voices we traditionally trust and those we don't and why. And then it also highlights how authority is connected with power, even if we don't want it to be. Those with power have the most authority, and zines, although very powerful, aren't often seen as sources that have power. Therefore, many people think they can lack authority. So zines help people with different things. So what have zines helped me with? Well, I've read about depression and anxiety, and I've learned that I'm not the only one who struggles with some things. I've read about grief from people who actually get it. I'm not being fed the 5 stages that anyone who has experienced grief knows simply isn't true. I've read about zines by those who identify as mixed race, which is an identity I share with them. So I've read about stories and statements and questions that have been asked of these people that made me feel recognized and seen. So I saw through those zines that my experiences were valid. But it wasn't peer-reviewed scholarly sources that helped me with these things. It was zines. And yes, there are some mainstream books that do tie into these topics. They're often harder to find, ones that I feel like actually get it. And that can always make me feel a little bit disgruntled. But a lot of times mainstream publications and research articles can miss that connection. They can miss that emotion that you're seeking out. Peer-reviewed sources also, which I've always been very lucky to have access to through a lot of my life. And I've definitely felt the lack of when I haven't had access to it. But peer-reviewed sources often have language in it that I don't always understand because my background isn't in psychology or critical race theory. But in zines, I find language that I do understand. And I also find this credibility because I'm seeing that emotion that has come with these experiences. And so these are the types of conversations I would have with students about how zines can help in these ways that you think that maybe they can't. So these also brought up about a really good discussion on what we consider an expert with students. So to tell a quick story, I was recently on Twitter and I saw a tweet by a mom whose daughter had just been diagnosed with autism. So the autism community, people who technically wouldn't be considered an expert unless they have a master's or a PhD in this area, very quickly jumped into this Twitter thread. They were very strongly disagreeing with what the doctors had recommended as next steps to the mom. They were very against many of the therapies that had been recommended because they had had experience with this, and for many of them, it was very traumatizing. Autism community is sometimes distrust of, does not trust these therapies for reasons I already said, but with autistic girls and autistic women, it can be even less trusting at times because many of the tests have been designed with boys in mind instead of girls, and girls display different signs of autism. And it's a perfect example of how it is those without authority that perhaps have more credibility than those with authority. So the lived experiences and knowledge is more trustworthy for them than perhaps the expert opinion is. And this is not me saying do not trust psychologists or doctors, absolutely do that, but it is an example of how we should also be looking at these other voices that have experience with this as well. So I often would ask students in class to tell me things that they felt they were knowledgeable in. A lot of times I was trying to get them to say, like, what do you consider yourself an expert in? A lot of times they would tell me things like, oh, I'm really good at sports, or I'm an expert in sports, video games. They would often mention the major that they're planning on pursuing, music, other interests like that. So most of the time there was some laughter that came with some of these answers. So video games, for an example. But it presented a good discussion because we talked about why are some topics or hobbies not taken as seriously as others, and why do we not want to hear about some of them? Students know that some interests and professional goals and careers are held in higher esteem than others. And for Gen Z, finding a way to improve society in some way is very important. They want to make a difference. So if students said that they want to be a professional video gamer, they knew it wouldn't typically be held in the same light as saying that they wanted to be a doctor or a lawyer. And they knew that there was a hierarchy that comes with hobbies and interests as there is with careers. And it plays into how seriously people take you, which in turn ties into how much credibility people view you with. It was also always a good segue into talking about zines and how they are often brushed off sometimes and the reasoning behind it. So another chance to participation. You can just put in the chat what you think you are the expert or you're knowledgeable on. So for myself, I put down a couple of examples. I think I'm pretty knowledgeable on undergraduate students, on outreach and libraries, and also some fun things. I used to have a hedgehog. I know a lot about hedgehogs, so I would consider myself pretty knowledgeable on that. I also love the game Animal Crossing. Ask me any question, I probably can give you an answer. So take a minute and put in the chat what you feel like you can be considered an expert on and knowledgeable about. Or you can unmute yourself, whatever you feel like. Dog pets, yes. Potato salad, nice, Julia. Knowledge about medieval studies. That sounds really interesting, Louisa. Scenes by women transforming. Yes, excellent. All right. So we have a lot of variety. Imposter syndrome. Oh, Sarah. Yeah, these are great. These are great examples. So we can see that we all have lots of different areas of knowledge, and that we can consider ourselves expert in things that have a lot of different variety. So thank you for participating with that. That's great. It's always fun to see what people are experts on. So let me go here. Next slide. All right. So these are the types of conversations that I would have with students to help them start taking themselves more seriously. They started thinking that maybe a person doesn't have to fit this expert idea in their head, and that they needed to start thinking more about what we mean when we say credible. That you can be credible about something if you've had this lived experience, even if you don't necessarily have the academic background, and that you should always be looking for these gaps in the conversations especially when you're doing a research paper and you're trying to find a variety of sources. One of the beautiful parts about zines is that they let students know that they can be the experts of their own lives. So sometimes I had a hard time getting them to say that they were an expert on something. And what I would tell them that if nothing else, they were the experts on their own lives because no one knew their life better than themselves because they were the one who had lived it every single day. All right, so the social justice zine collection helped me substantially with these conversations in the classroom. I was also able to provide actual examples for them to work with. But it created a lot of other opportunities in the classroom. And a number of faculty were very excited to try out zines in different ways. So I did create 2 zines for them that I always hand out to new faculty each year, and then also to give to any more senior faculty that were interested in the topic. They're very meta zines, so because they're zines about zines, but one was about zines and why they matter. The other was different examples of how to use them in the classroom. So to go into that a little bit more, there were several ways I used them. So first, let's talk about the classes I use them in. So first year inquiry classes that all first year students were supposed to take, but also different subject classes. So gender women's studies was a very popular area that they requested zine classes in. Also different languages, Spanish and German studies was another one, and then graphic design. And then in my own classes, I taught as a first year advisor. I often had students create a zine instead of a final reflection paper. And what I noticed was that students opened up in a way that they didn't with traditional paper formats. And I'm not entirely sure why. I think one of the reasons is that they felt like there was a lot of freedom and flexibility, and that gave them this confidence to share more about themselves. I also worked with several faculty about students having the option to do a zine as a research paper. So the research was still involved in this, and sources were cited, but they had more flexibility in how they designed it. And then also prison zines. I'm very sad about this actually, because it was in the making and then COVID hit. I was set to teach a zine making class in the local prison. So incarcerated individuals were going to make zines, and then I was going to give them the option if they wanted to include them in our zine collection at Augustana. So sadly, COVID got in the way of that. And then lastly, there were several classes that came that simply wanted their students to make a zine. About anything they wanted, it was just going to be an assignment. Students really enjoyed this. I got a lot of really positive feedback from faculty about it seemed to be just a nice mental health break actually in many ways for these students. And in these classes, I normally did a very short history and intro about what zines are. Most of the experience I had with students at Augustana, many of them were not aware of what zines were before, so it was a very brand new concept for them. So I want to make sure to give you time for questions, so I'm going to conclude this, but I do want to end this by just saying that zines hold up a mirror to higher education and to publishers and to libraries, and really anyone who is a gatekeeper to knowledge in some way. It can show us that we're missing stories because they may not pass our standards for inclusion, and they don't often fall under what we consider authoritative or credible, but they can be. So including zines such as the Social Justice Zine Collection can be an excellent way to help students not only work through experiences in their own lives, but also learn a lot about what other people go through. I put this quote on here from Roald Dahl's Matilda. I recently rewatched the movie with my daughter, and this quote really jumped out at me that is actually from the actual book. And it's these books gave Matilda a hopeful and comforting message. You are not alone. And when I heard it, I was like, oh, zines are the same way. They just let people know that they aren't alone, that they give this really hopeful message to them saying that it's okay and that your experiences are valid and you are here. All right, so I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and open up the floor for any questions. Now turn on my video.
Maria, thank you. That was amazing. I loved every bit of it, and I feel like I learned a lot.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so I'm going through the chat. Julia says, how do you think about the difference between authority and expertise? Like, do I think, like, what do I think about, could you expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah, I'm like, this might not be relative. I'm not like, I guess I just think personally, I reacted to the word authority with a kind of like what I felt like it connotated, like the emotional sense I had to it. And I was wondering, like, you know, especially when you're using it with students, you're asking them what they're an expert in rather than what they're an authority in. I don't know. I'm just wondering if you could expand upon, you know, the two things, but I don't mean to like start an academic discussion about.
No, it's a good question. It's a good question. It was always kind of difficult having that conversation with students because, like I said, like they have when they're 18 years old, they have a hard time realizing that they actually can have authority in these very different ways. Because I still think they're like, oh, I had to be a grown up to like have authority. So having to reframe that is always really important. And it did seem to always be easier to get them to understand that, to wrap their brain more around the fact that you could be an expert in something. For some reason, they always seem to be more okay with that than the fact that they could have authority. And I think too, like, maybe it's a personal thing. I don't really like the word authority. Like it just kind of can come, it comes off as powerful. And I think that sometimes that can be kind of scary for people, if that makes sense. Or maybe you don't want to be seen as someone who takes something away from others. I don't really feel like I'm answering your question right now, I'm sorry. But yeah, it's basically, it was always an interesting conversation with students. And you can also, sometimes not to speak badly of students because I absolutely love students, but you could see the ones who normally have more entitlement in their lives because they very much were like, oh yeah, I can do this, I have authority, as opposed to the ones that didn't. So sorry if that did not answer your question. Thanks. Okay, how do we handle content trigger warnings in zines? Yes, in my cataloging project, I have run into a lot of personal zines that could be potentially triggered. Yes, absolutely. This is a fantastic question. When I was teaching them in classes, I would say like some of these topics can be really triggering, just so students knew. And we always put the subject on the front of the zine. So it would say something like sexual assault on the front. And then when they were in like the way we showed them in the library, there would be in these different, I'm forgetting the word, but like box folders that would have that subject heading on it. So that way students knew ahead of time, okay, this is what the zine is going to be about. So if I don't want to go into that area, then I'm not going to. I have noticed that there were several classes that I had where students actually made zines about their own personal experience with sexual assault, to keep going with this example. And we always like made sure, like with Title IX and stuff, we had to report it, but every time that it happened, the student had already gone through the Title IX process. And it was very much like a way for them to work through this trauma that they had experienced. So I think it's really important to talk about trigger warnings. But I do think I was always like worried about that, but in my experience, at least, it always was very much like students needed to see this, like they needed to read it from someone else who like actually got it. Any other questions?
I have kind of a boring question about cataloging.
Yeah.
I know a lot of places kind of treat it like, you know, like here's almost like archives, like here's a box that I got from so-and-so, and they don't really do item level cataloging for them. Is that, I mean, there's not always an author for zines and it can be hard to like, you know, figure all that information out. So did you do like item level at Augustana, or did you just like kind of categorize them and then put them in a, you know, the box on the shelf?
Yeah, that was basically what we did. Also, Augustana's like a super small college, so sometimes it depends on the college that you're at. So Augie, it was like 2,300 students, I think. It was very small. So we were able to do things differently in our library than like a bigger institution can do. But yeah, it basically was like I ordered the zine. I knew what it was going to be about. I gave it a category when I got the zine, and then I would bring it down to our technical services librarian, and I basically had her do her magic, because I also just don't really know much about cataloging. I just told her it has to be in a way that is easy to locate. So that's why she made sure it was all in one location, and that it was always also like, if you typed in social justice, these zines would come up. So even if you didn't know who the creator was, that's okay. It still will come up in some way. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if they were catalog searchable or like just mostly browsable.
Yeah, I mean, you could, if you knew the title, you could search it that way. But it was basically like type in zines or type in social justice and then like narrow it down by location. So unfortunately, like if you just were browsing the catalog, which I don't know how many times students do that for fun, but if they were, they probably wouldn't stumble across it super easily. But in the classes, I always walk them through that.
Yeah, Louisa has some good points in the chat and a question.
Yeah. It is super hard. Yeah, that was definitely something we talked about. And I don't really think, honestly, I wasn't like super happy with deciding to just have it under one. And maybe that would have changed later on. A lot of this was a trial and error process too, because I didn't exactly know what I was doing. So we changed some things as time went on, but I mean, the collection's still there. I'm not there anymore, but one of our staff is working with it, who has a really big interest in zines, and I'm not sure if they have decided to change anything or not. Maybe they found a better way than I did. Am I familiar with zines? Essay as a topic? No, I'm not, Virginia. That would be, it sounds really interesting though.
I'm teaching a class on historiography of Los Angeles, especially the experience of Mexicans in Los Angeles. And I thought instead of the final historiographic essay, perhaps a zine would be an interesting alternative for the students, but I'm not familiar with what that format would look like, and I wouldn't know how to explain it to them without some examples.
Yeah, it sounds fascinating. It sounds like a really good idea. I also have not really any idea how to go about that, but I think that would be really fun to do though. Well, that's cool, Jenna. I like that. Also, when you're looking at zines, I'm looking at how to describe metadata to personal experience. A lot of times what I noticed was when I was purchasing zines from zine distros is that it would already be under a topic. So like if most of these distros would have like a section for sexual assault, a section for activism, a section for mental illness. So a lot of the work had already been done. So clearly these zine creators wanted it in those areas. That's how they felt like it worked the best for them. I'm pretty sure it's them. Maybe it was a person who was in charge of the zine distro. I'm hoping not. They seem to listen to zine creators pretty well, but that could be one way. I have some. Yeah.
I guess I can just add, I've been in some conversations with archives related to zine projects and documenting student activism. And so we wanted to have a little bit more conversations about when it comes to documenting student activism, making sure that we're considering people's safety, because there's a lot of assumptions if people are attending protests that they want to be seen. And the concern with that is sometimes things are documented and actually get sent to archives, but there may not have necessarily been individuals' consent. And so there's been more conversations. There's even been some stuff that we've decided to restrict, not saying that researchers can't come and look at the material, but that we just need to have a better understanding of how it's going to be used. And so even with zines, there's been some conversations just within gathering different writings and even images, but also wanting to make sure that it's being approached very carefully and that there really is consent. So it's making, I think it's answering a lot of important questions, but it definitely makes the conversations, I think, a little bit, I'm rambling, critical, but I think that there is no easy solution to it, which is why we need to keep these conversations happening.
Yeah, absolutely. That is definitely a really tricky thing to consider. Are these zines though that students are donating?
It's been more community based,
Okay.
but of course, because there's a huge history of student activism on campus. And I think part of what I've also considered is that, because I've heard a lot of people say, well, if you're at a protest and you want to be seen, well, there are some people that do, and that was a huge tactic, especially during the civil rights movement in the 60s. But there's also many people that go out there because they may feel that's the best way to really, express such an important need. And so I think because now it's so much easier for people to pull out their phone and document something without maybe considering there could be some other consequences that come within that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that is really interesting. Yeah, I often, when it came to, and this doesn't entirely relate to what you're saying, but it did get me thinking about this, was that zines don't have to be shared. So, I would tell students, like, you can make a zine and it could just be for you. You don't have to share this with anyone. It can just be like a therapeutic thing, or because you like to make things with your hands. But like, that's the nice thing, is like, you're just making it to make it. It can be shared if you want it to, but that's your choice. So yeah, kind of similar with like the protest is like, great, go. I'm sorry, maybe this doesn't relate at all, but it did get me thinking about it. But yeah, with the protest, it is tricky, because like, you do kind of assume that if you're at a protest, you want to be seen, but that isn't always the case. So sometimes you do want it to be a more private thing. Oh, this is great, Jenna. The Zine Librarian's Code of Ethics for questions like this. This is great. Thank you for posting that.
If there are no more questions, I might end this a minute early just to get on our next Zoom call. Oh, Maria, did you have contact information you wanted to share?
Yeah, so this is my email. I'm also on Twitter. I'm pretty sure that's my Twitter account. I actually should know that better. But yeah, feel free to reach out to me with any questions or anything. I love talking about zines, so. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Maria. This was really great. And thank you all for joining and contributing to the discussion. Bye all.